Welcome back to Between the Levees. I'm joined today at long last by Mr. Walter Lee Morris. He spent about 8 years in industry, some on deck and plenty in a shoreside role. He is now an attorney in the maritime industry. Walter, thank you for finally joining me.
It's a pleasure, Tim. Good to see you.
It's been about 9 months, I think, since we were first introduced. You knew Kenny Grappel from a past life, and he reached out to me saying that you'd reached out to him, said, "Hey, let's make this introduction. I'd really love to share a different side of things." So I appreciate you reaching out. I appreciate the interest, and I'm glad we can finally get this done.
Oh, most definitely. Most
Well,
definitely.
first things first, where did you meet Kenny?
I met Kenny back in 2007. Uh, he actually interviewed me for the shoreside position with AEP Convent. He and I met at the airport actually, and I was in between jobs and wanted to continue my career in the river industry. And so Kenny and Darren Chambers came and picked me up at the airport in New Orleans, and uh, I was lucky enough to get the position as a dispatcher at AEP Convict. So our adventure started there.
Well, I know Kenny and Darren. They've both been on this program. What I know of them, I can only imagine what a job interview must have been like. When I first met Kenny, I walked in the door to AEP for my first day, and he pretty much said, "Who the hell are you? What are you doing here?" So how was that job interview?
Well, of course, I showed up in suit and tie when they picked me up in the airport, and they said, "Hey, we're not picking up the CEO. Who are you?" I said, "I'm Walter Morris. I'm the gentleman you've been waiting 4 hours for, since my plane had been delayed so long." And we just instantly became friends. I sat down with him and Darren and uh, went through what I had done in my previous jobs, and since my experience with the river really helped uh, to know the day-to-day situations, both on the river and as well in the office side as far as doing logistics. In my previous job, I was doing logistics in Harahan and Marrero for American Commercial Barge Line. And then with that, uh, the move to convent as a convent convict uh, was a little bit more of a challenge because there was a lot more pieces to the puzzle uh, but than before. I can remember moving down there December 15th of 2007 and Darren taking me out to the Outback Steakhouse and said, well, welcome to the crew, my friend. We'll see you there bright and early at 8 o'clock in the morning. And of course, as soon as I got there at 8 o'clock, they said, "Oh, you need to go to Baton Rouge and, of course, do the drop test and make sure you're not some drug head." So the funny thing was, when I got to the doctor's office, they had mistold the doctor and said that I was a deckhand and not an office personnel. So I got poked, prodded, and tickled for approximately 4 hours. And then I got a phone call from Darren going, "Where the hell are you? You were only supposed to, go in the cup, go for it." And I was like, they checking me for everything. And then the best part about that was is that, several weeks into working with Kenny and Darren, I was placed on nights, and Kenny and I worked together for the first week or so. And he basically said, "Ah, you got this," and would leave me at midnight all by myself with a 600 barge fleet to play with. And so once my fellow captains from my old job talked to my captains up here at Convent, they knew that I wasn't just some person who didn't know anything. I was actually part of the crew. And the funny thing was is that 2 weeks after joining AEP, I got a phone call saying I needed to apply for the job because I didn't go through the necessary steps that AEP corporate in Columbus wanted us to go through. So I had to apply for a job I already had. So it was quite interesting to say the least.
Well, we'll work our way to that point in your career as we talk some more. But I was messaging with you earlier,
Yes,
and I
sir.
was talking with some friends in the industry before I was communicating with you. And I had a question for you to, in the framework of your life in the industry, and then of course now as an attorney. Um, Dispatchers these days can't demand that any pilot or captain at the sticks anywhere in this country do anything that they deem unsafe or inappropriate. I honor that framework as my decisions and needs in the office have no impact whatsoever on the potential for loss of life, destruction of property, or injuries, major and minor. Has that been a problem in the past? And also, has any of the evidence presented in cases you've worked over the years shown proof of foul play of that sort?
Let me start with a disclaimer on that these are my own opinions and are not to be construed as legal advice. Those who are seeking legal advice need to contact a competent attorney for their own legal matters. That being said, when it comes down to office personnel or port captains pushing a captain or a pilot to do something that they deem not safe, it basically goes from the fact that in legal cases it comes it becomes an issue of error in navigation, meaning that the master and commander of the vessel, or the captain or the pilot, is in sole command of that vessel. Therefore, if he decides under peer pressure to go ahead with moving those barges and the towboat in a situation that causes loss of life or peril or loss of equipment with collision and elision, ultimately the courts have always stated that it was the fault of the captain and the pilot who deemed that they were ready to attempt that journey. Only in instances where you can find evidence where the vessel itself was unseaworthy are they allowed to be excused. So, in that point being said, is that yes, there have been several cases that have happened throughout the years where the office has pushed the captain to make mileage or to make time in situations where it would not be best for the vessel and its crew members. Point being, several years ago, back in 2015, with the container ship, the SS El Faro, it was deemed that it was an error of navigation because the captain, even though being pressured by his office to make the time, he decided to take a vessel, go through the hurricane, and of course, the vessel being uh, in the shape it was in peril was lost at sea. Now, there were competing arguments in that case where they said that the El Faro was not as seaworthy as its predecessors are, or the newer vessels, especially with the advent of new life-saving equipment. That vessel in particular had open lifeboats like they had on on the Titanic. And now that with newer seagoing vessels, of course, they've got closed in life-saving procedures. However, there was a huge point there because the office was pushing pressure. The court still deemed that it was at the end of the day, the master and commander of that vessel made the choice to proceed with his journey, and unfortunately made the wrong decision and the ship sunk. Another closer example happened in the river industry, in my opinion, with the incident with the Mel Oliver, which happened in 2008. And in that case, it was between DRD and ACBL. And that situation occurred when the port captain of DRD allowed for his captain to get off the vessel in order to uh, go investigate a situation with his wife at home. As many people know, on the river, the quote unquote donkey man, he had fears that his wife was cheating on him. So he took the port captain's vehicle and left the Mel Oliver, leaving a steersman without having the proper license command the vessel. And of course, as the vessel was not manned by a licensed personnel, you really shouldn't have gone northbound out of uh, Stone Oil or Gretna and proceeded northbound towards the Harvey Lock, where eventually he fell asleep and then the ship T-boned him, and he immediately caused a huge oil spill that shut down the water system in New Orleans for a period of time. That pilot or steersman went to the LA Avenue dock and proceeded to run away and eventually got caught. But that whole situation with the river industry, what it clearly says is that the port captain, should have said to the company, "Hey, we do not have a licensed vessel or licensed operator on this vessel. We have to tie up." But instead, they chose to make money and proceeded and caused a huge environmental disaster as well as a potential loss of life. And eventually, unfortunately, some of those port captains and people involved ended up in jail because of it.
I'd heard some of that. It's in the last maybe 5 years of just being around in the industry. But I guess over the years, how full has your caseload been? Have you been, I see, I won't even try to pronounce your current employer, the Moroccan-based French words.
Oh
We'll,
yes.
we'll get into that in a little bit, but is your caseload over the years, um, how many of them have been in sort of that extreme an example or in those capacities?
Not many, not many at all. That's a rare occurrence that happens. Now, one must know that a international ship in the ocean, there is a loss of a vessel approximately once every week, um, either to unseaworthiness, storms, and other things that happen along the whole international waterways. But as far as the river industry, accidents are few and far between because of uh, the skill and navigation that we put through on our captains and pilots to make sure that they are competent in moving up and down the river.
Well, we will work our way to those points, I think, as we walk through your life and career. But looking on the resume you shared with me, it looks like you started on deck for ACBL in 1997, made your way to lead man in about a year and a half or so, and then parted ways at that point. Walk me through, excuse me, walk me through your life up to joining the industry.
All right. Well, we'll start with my senior year in high school. I had finished up, was about to finish high school in 1997 in Louisville, Kentucky. And my father gave me three options. One was to go ahead and go to community college, work for UPS, get an apartment, and go from there. The second one was to, uh, but you're leaving the house. The second one was that I would go get a job, move out of the house, and start building my own career. And the third option was with a friend of his with American Commercial Barge Line, who was the legal counsel for them at the time, and that was to look for Huck Finn and Mark Twain on the river system. So I chose option three because I could stay at home. So that's how I started. And I turned 18 in July of 1997, and by August 8th, 1997, I found myself on the Cumberland River, mile 103 at the Cumberland City TVA power plant, going, "Where's Kathy Lee Gifford?" I thought there was a deck here with a hot tub and all this other stuff. No, I found myself at midnight with a ratchet in my hand, going, "What the hell did I get myself into?" And those first two trips on the R.H. O'Neill were pretty hard. I had a captain and deckhands that were, they thought of me as being a person that might have office connections, and they were afraid to get close to me. Uh, Here I was, a kid growing up, very privileged, growing up in the country club, and literally within 40 days of being on the river, I was a 40-year-old blue collar asshole who didn't put up with a lot of stuff. And you know, it was that direct time where I really feel like I grew up instead of being the innocent child or teenager at the time. I had responsibilities and I had to fulfill them. I remember walking onto the R.H. O'Neill that night, and the legal counsel at HBO had sat down with a legal pad, and he showed me a whole bunch of photos of what has happened in the past and how you're supposed to listen to your captains and pilots and deckhands because the river industry is very dangerous in itself. But he gave me a couple other notes about courtesy and professionalism that it seems lost sometimes these days. And one was when you walk up to the wheelhouse that you knock on the door and proceed to ask for permission to go upstairs because you never know what the captain is up to, especially going through a bridge and that kind of thing in a technical situation. But we were tied up. So I knocked on the door, opened it up slightly because I wanted to hear what this man was saying to the lead man before I walked up the door. Me being a little nosy, not sure what these guys were going to think of me when I first walked on. And I can never forget the captain saying to the lead man, "This kid has office written all over him. I want you to work the dog out of him, and I want him gone within 2 weeks." So I knocked on the door, opened it. I said, "Captain, may I proceed?" And I went upstairs and signed in on my first day on the R.H. O'Neill. Fast forward my second trip, crew dispatch didn't like me. They stuck me on the same vessel, and I was like, shoot, I'm stuck on the TVA coal run. And by that time, the captain had come back from his time off, and when it was time for me to leave, I walked upstairs and I told the story to the captain. I said, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I survived 75 days on your vessel, and I didn't leave after 2 weeks. So he goes, "Son, you've done a good job. Keep your head up. You're more than welcome to be back on this vessel at any time." And I will say that was a humbling experience to have the confidence of the captain at that time. My third trip is really when I started to really like working on the towboat, especially I met a gentleman by the name of George Rayford that was a big, tall black guy, and he taught me the ropes. He really cared about me. He wasn't just somebody that says, "Oh, here's just another kid. Let's make fun of him and that kind of thing. Let's see what he can do." And George and a captain by the name of Steve, and I please excuse me, Steve, if I've forgotten your last name. Uh, he Those two showed me the ropes on how to be a deckhand, how to go into the barges and stuff like that, and really learn how to do the tow and what it takes to steer and stuff like that. And I remember at the Madison Coal Power Plant on the Ohio River, George and I were to go check tow. Of course, being on a coal run, you always had the oldest barges in the fleet, which made sure that you had a lot of leaking barges. So I was pretty good with the 1.5 inch pump, to say the least. And I'll never forget, we walked on tow and it was snowing outside and or snow on the deck. And George is like, "All right, now look, watch how I walk on the steel because it's very slippery and dangerous." And George made maybe 3 or 4 steps onto the deck of the barge and plopped right down on his butt. And I said, "Well, am I supposed to walk and then drop to my bottom? Because that's gonna hurt. This is steel. It doesn't feel too good." And Captain Steve at the time was just laughing on the radio, going, "Oh my God, take your time. It's all gonna work out." And from that trip, I really started to enjoy the river. There was less pressure. The Duncan L. Hines, which I worked on, was a really great vessel. Each deck-in had its own room. There's a lot of space, and it was a 2800, so there wasn't 15 barges. It was usually 12 to 9 barges. The only drawback to that vessel was that it always got tied up, and I tried and tried for my fourth and fifth trip to get back to that vessel. My fourth trip, I ended up on the James W. Buki and rode with a captain by the name of Full Ahead Ed. And Full Ahead Ed, uh, he liked to go fast, which means that when we got to Cairo, he was trying to steal people's toes and wanted to make miles. He says, "You can't make no money, Walter Lee, if we're just sitting around. We gotta get on. Let's go." And I'll never forget, we were close to on the Tennessee River, close to Kentucky Lock, and it was raining and storming, and it was not pleasant at all. And it was thundering and lightning, and I'll never forget. It was right around crew change, and the captain said, I walked up there. I said, "Cap, it's a little lightning's hitting pretty close." He goes, son, you'll be fine. Don't worry." And sure enough, lightning struck the federal cell right across the river. And the lead man outside said, "I need a spike pole to make sure we could get all the driftwood and other things to make sure the barges came together." And I looked at the captain and I said, "I'll do anything you ask me to do, Cap, but I don't know if it's a good idea for me to go walk out there with a 15-foot aluminum pole with all this lightning around." And excuse me, he said, "Son, does your heart belong to Jesus?" I said, "Yes, sir." He goes, "You got the rubber on the soles of your boots?" I said, "Yes, sir." "Then get on out there. We got to make money. We can't be sitting around here worrying about the weather. You're not a weatherman. Let's go." And I tell you what, those 800 feet that I walked out building tow was probably the most scariest time that I had on the river, because I could feel the static electricity and the hair raising on my head and in my arms from the lightning being so close. But it, it gave me a sense that I should always, listen to my captains and pilots, because they knew what's best. And yeah, in hindsight now with the legal education, I would freak out if a captain told an employee to go out there and do that. But back then it was like, these people have done it before. They've been out in those situations. They're not going to put you or their license in harm for you to do something stupid. And then, of course, them, as they always say, the captains and pilots fill out a whole bunch of paperwork and end up in front of people like me who asked way too many questions. And then I did a trip on the Charles E. Peters, which I sort of called, it was a 5,600 Jeff boat, long vessel. And it was an interesting trip on that one. I called it the slave trade. It was from Cairo to St. Louis, and it was 3 days up, 18 hours back. And I hate working in the fleet, because no matter what I did or how whatever happened, I always got stuck in the rain, stuck in the snow, or it was just miserable being out there, especially at Cairo, with everything going around. And I did that for a trip, and then I was fortunate to take a trip on the JW Hershey, where I went. Uh, I was on that vessel twice. I went up to Chicago or Lockport, to the uppermost part, and I got to go on the Illinois River and realize that it was a 300-mile fleet, because every 15, 20 miles you had to stop, pull the barge out in the middle of the tow, then lace it all back up again, and then continue your journey. And then I was really lucky to go from St. Louis to St. Paul, Minnesota, and back. And I really enjoyed that trip, being on the upper. Though it was a lot of work, of course, making those locks and breaking tow here and there. Uh, I went and I explored more of the river that not many people got to go on. And then on my sixth trip and so on, I was able to get back on the Duncan L. Hines, and uh, I was able to convince the captain at the time to send me into lead man school, and finally was able to become a lead man. And I really it wasn't really the power trip from back in the day as a child at 19. It was the fact that I felt confident in what I was doing, and I had convinced the captain that I was ready. So the Duncan L. Hines was my boat from there on out, and I really had a lot of really interesting experiences. My 19th birthday, I spent out there on the river, and it was pretty interesting because there was a cook there, and the cook Desiree will probably kill me for telling this story, but 19 years old, I'm coming down out of the bunk. I had my Carhartts on, one buckle undone, hair a mess. And she goes, I hear it's your 19th birthday today. And I said, yes, ma'am. She goes, well, I baked you a cake, and tonight I'm going to make you a man. And I was like, huh, what's going on here? So she was making me a cake, and they blow out the candles. And that woman chased me up and down that vessel trying to get me to have a little fun. And I'll never forget going up to the wheelhouse, and I said, Cap, I'm all about playing games, and this has been fun, but Desiree's going to try to attack me. And he goes, son, if you don't handle that cook and take care of her, I'm going to end up with burnt biscuits for the rest of my trip, and I'm going to be pissed. And I'm going to be pissed at you because you're the one that didn't take one for the team. And I was like, oh, crap. I can't do this. This is going to be bad. And I went down to the crew lounge, and there she was, just with a big smile on her face. And she goes, I hope you enjoyed your joke. I've never seen you run as fast as you as you have before. And that was it was pretty fun. I really it was a sense of community and being part of a crew, because there's only 9 people, 9 to 10 people on a boat, and everybody comes from a different background. For me at that time, I was 19. Uh, I had plans on going to college, and you learn a lot of lessons, especially from the captains and pilots that were uh, in the Vietnam era, that were pushing me. Like, Walt, you don't belong out here. You need to you know go to college, become something, come back to the river if you want to, but you got something more in you. And it was sort of like a father son type relationship, but also a big brother relationship. And there was a lot of scary times. I mean, I've had trees falling on me. I've had uh, wires break, rigging flying at me, and luckily I haven't had any serious accidents when I was working on the river. But it was always in the back of my mind that something does and can happen. It's a matter of time. So I made sure to always play into the safety part of it and make sure that I was doing what I was supposed to do. But you're gonna have some fun. You have to. The job is sometimes mundane. You don't. It's the day-to-day grind, and especially being in a coal trade, where you're going from Madison, Indiana, to the river dock at Norfolk and Southern, up below Greenup Lock. You know, it's 9 barges or 12 barges, and of course, every damn barge always leaked. And I had some interesting arguments with a pilot who was a trip pilot that got on me because I only put 2 1.5 inch pumps on a leaking barge, and I said, "Hey, 1.5 plus 1.5 equals 3 inches. It'll work out. Don't worry about it." And I got really good at measuring the amount of gasoline it took to pump down the barges, and of course going in the rabbit hole and sitting there with cedar shingles and pounding them in and creating more holes than I fixed. But when they're rusty and crusty, you got to do what you got to do. Uh, and then as I trained deckhands, I had, of course, jokes I would play. Hiding in the manholes. That was my favorite one. Boo, it's me. And doing the fun stuff that keeps everybody on their toes and happy. One of my favorite tricks that was played on me was a captain wanted me to polish the horns of the vessel, and I knew from other stories I had heard on the river, when they ask you to go polish the horns, make sure you have your hearing protection because they're going to blow the horns on you. So of course I go up there and I took the most sacred object on a towboat, and that is a freshly printed new edition Sunday newspaper, especially in those days, before the internet really took grasp. And it was funny. You could lay $100 bill on the Cali table, and people would sit there and they would fold it nicely, or they'd lay it out, steam it, and make it clean as possible. They would not touch that $100 bill. But if you put a new magazine, especially a naughty magazine or a pornographic magazine and a newspaper, you could blink your eyes and that thing would be gone. It'd be gone. But so I went upstairs and I knew what was about to happen. I put a hearing protection in, and I ran up there with that freshly printed paper, and I went upstairs with a shackle and a pin and some cowtail, and I quickly stripped in the middle of uh, of a fall day down to my underwear and my t-shirt, and I waited because I knew it was going to happen. So I stuffed the mannequin type thing with my Carhartts and tied on a shackle and pin so it had some weight. And so I could hear him giggling to a certain extent downstairs, but not much from the engine noise and stuff. And I knew it was coming. And then all of a sudden, big, and I was like, "Uh-oh, here it's time." And you're so ready, prepared, and you're polishing too, but you got to give it a second. And I gave it a quick second, threw the dummy in front of the wheelhouse and onto the forward deck of the boat. And the captain comes running out onto the side and goes, "Oh crap, I've killed him." And I looked up and I said, "Ah, voice from above, Cap." Nice try. I appreciate it. And that was the day that I signed on regular at the on the Duncan L. Hines. But that was quite a fun time, especially here I was. It's 19, 18, 19, almost 20. I worked 30 on, 30 off, and I traveled the world, and I had money in my pocket. But I knew towards the end, in May of 1999, that it was my time to proceed with the next goal of my life, and that was to complete college.
Well, I do see there's about a 10-year gap between getting off deck and starting shoreside. But before we get into that section of your life or that time period, uh, you said your father had ties to ACBL. Did he work for them?
No, no, it was just a family friend from a country club who was the lead legal counsel for ACBL at the time.
And had there been any maritime industry exposure to your family prior to your hopping on the boat in '97?
No, no, sir.
All right. Well, then cut ahead. Fill me out on that decade between leaving ACBL and turning back up shoreside.
All righty. Well, after I got done with the boat, I went to community college for about 3 years, and I had my heart into it, but it really didn't. I was sort of struggling along, and uh, unfortunately, my grandparents passed away at that time, so I ended up finally moving into my grandparents' house in Louisville, and I wanted to get moving, so sort of put some more adulthood into me, and I finally was able to get accepted to the University of Kentucky in 2022. When I got to the University of Kentucky, of course, I was a lot older than most freshmen or sophomores at the time. So, I was already over the age of 21. So, alcohol and everything really didn't do anything for me. I had partied when I was 10 and 11 with my sister down at Vanderbilt, going to fraternity and sorority parties. So I had already completed that juncture in my life. And so basically, I decided to get into politics, and I was elected vice president of the College Republicans at the University of Kentucky after the fall of 2022. And then after that, I was the president and chairman of the College Republicans in 2003. And I did a lot of politicking. I got to go to every horse farm in Lexington, basically. I met a lot of politicians, and they knew me by first name, and parked a lot of cars, ate a lot of ate a lot of food at these fundraisers, and didn't pay a dime, and it was perfect. And I always loved parking cars because the older, the crappier the car, the bigger the tip. If somebody rolled up in a brand new Benz, you weren't getting much. But if it was the old nasty Cadillac, you were going to get at least $10. And for being in college, that was cool, you know. And uh, I went to UK. I was a history major, and thank God for the History Channel because I probably wouldn't have passed. Uh, I was one of those guys that did better watching the documentaries than sitting there reading the books. The funny thing was that, uh, history has a lot to do, especially with the river industry and going from steamboats to the Martin Barge thing. And I actually wrote several papers on the river industry when I was in college. Uh, but the politics was one of my main games. Got really into it. I didn't do a fraternity or sorority. I became an intern, a paid intern at the Republican Party of Kentucky, which allowed me to have access to a BlackBerry, which was really cool back in those days. And so I had two phones. I was always on call. I was even in an economics class when the fifth congressional representative for Kentucky called me on accident and thought it was my boss because he and I drove 35,000 miles in my Suburban throughout the state of Kentucky. And the wife really thought I was weird. My boss's wife had exactly the same model, same color, same Suburban as I did. And she thought I was a little weird, but when your father's a car dealer, you don't get to pick the car you want to drive. You get what's on the lot. And well, that's the Suburban I got. So I was the soccer mom, if you know what I mean. So I had the fifth congressional leader call me, the representative Hal Rogers called me in econ class, and the economics professor was one of those guys where she would answer your phone if your phone went off. And I looked at the professor and I said, Professor, if I was you, I would not answer that phone call. I promise you, it's the area code for DC. You're not going to have a good day. And of course, she picks up the phone and yes, Walter's in economics class. He doesn't have time for you. Click. And I was like, oh. So I quickly excused myself from class, called the number back as Congressman Rogers. I deeply apologize for what had just happened. And he's like, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. But by the way, let me have her phone number, her name and a phone number that I can call the dean to. So I got on my BlackBerry, found out who the dean of the school was, and sent it to him. And sure enough, the next day or next week that we were back in class, she pulled me aside and says, "Please put your phone on vibrate, and I will not answer your phone." I said, "Well, Rise decision. You should have listened to me in the first place." But going along in my college career, as an intern, I got to do a lot of things that most people didn't. I got to go in backdoor meetings. I got to see the inside of the party. I got to go to New York for the convention. I got to meet the president. I've got key leaders from the party knew me, and it was an interesting time. And at the time, the governor of Kentucky was a Republican. So in 2004, 2005, um, I had finished up my last semester technically at UK. I had one more class to go, and I finished up the fall of 2004 with my best GPA. And even though I was working, I had 18 hours. Most of them were postgraduate level history classes, and uh, I was working for the party 3 days a week. And so in 2005, I started looking for a job. And I went and I applied for a job with the governor's office. And it was pretty interesting. I didn't get the response I thought I was going to get from being working at the party and doing that kind of thing. I was in an interview, and two gentlemen that were a little bit, maybe 2 or 3 years older than I was, you know, started asking me a lot of questions, and the towboat walk came out. And it's a part of me that I try to cage and not bring out too much unless I'm in court or I need to put somebody down. And these two gentlemen asked me, how could I have loyalty to the party if my father was still registered as Democrat? And so I slammed my BlackBerry down on the table and I said, I don't see you all having one of these. This was issued by the party. So you can take that question and shove it. And the only job I could get was governor at Vance, and it paid less than I worked on when I was working on the boat. And then I was like, no, I don't need to do this. So a job came up with ACBL, and I started looking around and figuring out who I needed to talk to get a in to get into that position. And I finally found a gentleman that used to work in the transportation department for the Kentucky, and he made an introduction for me, and there I was. And but before I took the job there, I went and talked to Senator McConnell's head guy, and I asked him. I said, if you were in my shoes at this age, 26, what should I do? Should I go work for the governor, or should I go into DC, and or should I go back to the river industry?" And he goes, "You got to follow your heart." And I said, I really, the river brought me a lot of life lessons, and there was a lot of things that I would like to do, uh, from working on the boat to being in the office and possibly change and make things better for our crew members out there. And so uh, the gentleman told me, he goes, by the way, in about 3 weeks, you will not want to work for the governor because there'll be a hiring scandal. And so 2 weeks go by. I'm starting my first week at ACBL, and sure enough, the hiring scandal hit Fletcher's administration, and I would have been right in the middle of it. So, sort of like a blessing from God that I stayed away and started with ACBL in the office.
Well, let's keep marching on. What was the job with ACBL, and how did you end up making the jump to that interview with our mutual friends?
All right. So back in 2005, I applied for the position for a Houston fleet manager. Unbeknownst to me, it was going to be for the lower Gulf fleet manager. Uh, I was I had a phone interview at first with my boss's boss, and that went well. I went in to ACBL and to the main office, and I had been used to going to the office once or twice when I was a deckhand. And so I went in and I sat down there at the conference room table and said, "Look, this is who I am. I worked on the boat. I was a deckhand. I know the ins and outs on how things are done, um, and that I would be a good match as a dispatcher because of my experience and being able to relate with the captains and pilots and the deckhands as well." And so uh, a week or two later, they called me up. They said, "All right, let's start." And so I started at ACBL, and it was an interesting time for me because you know, at first, when my first week there, I didn't know if I really wanted to do this because it wasn't the job I thought it was going to be. In logistics, I've always found no matter how well you make a move or how well you think of something, somebody's always going to say, "Oh, I could have done it better." You always had the Monday morning quarterbacking. But I was fortunate this time when the first week at ACBL, I was flown down to meet my captains and pilots and potential customers, and then I was able to relate with those guys, and they knew me, and I met them personally, which I think is a big deal, especially working with logistics. If you don't know your captains and pilots, you don't know how to ask them in certain situations, and there's not the repertoire between the office and the boats. And that was one thing that I didn't like uh, at that company, is because um, they didn't promote it. You worked in the office, you don't work on the boat, and there was always that sense of tension between the two parties, and I wasn't like that. I always was kind and nice, and I still had my job performance I had to complete as far as the office goes, but there was ways to get things done that was a lot nicer to people than just barking out orders or sending them through email and saying, "Oh, here you got this to do." "Hey Cap, can you help me out?" And I always felt like I did much better with my captains and pilots if I talked to them outside uh, while smoking a cigarette, and talking about their kids, their wives, and getting to know them without the intervention of my superiors in the office. I actually hated the fact that people sat there in a cubicle and marked the time when I had left my desk and was communicating with customers and other people, because I was more of a confidential kind of person. I wanted to talk to these people, but I didn't need the outside interference, and that's what was a big rub for me. And in turn, really sort of made my exit out of ACBL a little bit faster. A few stories with them was that you know I always I was always on top of what I was doing. I could be away from my desk and tell you exactly where all my boats were, at what time, what they were doing. And I had a gentleman that was my boss, who's now deceased, that would always try to pick a fight with me and basically put me in his office and made me cry. And it pissed me off because I was so mad that this man didn't have the trust in me and knew my performance, how I could talk to the captains and pilots. But because I couldn't do it in front of the desk, uh, or like how other people did it, I somehow cheated the company out of something. And I'll never forget, it was 15 miles an hour down in Marrero Fleet at the time, and the wind was up. They were building a 15 barge fleet tow to go northbound, empty barges, and I had about had enough with my boss at that time, at that day, and he called me into his office and berated me. Said, "Oh, Walter, you're too nice to your captains and pilots. They're telling you one thing and doing another. You're not getting what you're supposed to get out of them." And I looked at this gentleman and I said, "Sir, with all due respect, how many 15 barge tows have you wired up in your life?" And I can tell you the answer is none. You've been sitting here as a desk jockey and have never worked on a boat. You don't know what it takes. You don't know the hassles of wind and having drift in between the barges and having to wire them up to ACBL code, which a lot of wires that you don't have to lay. But you don't understand what it takes and how long you've got your deckhands out there in the wind or in the rain, and how long people will last when they put them or work them too hard. when decisions are made poorly and accidents happen. So it took 6 hours for them to build a 15 barge tow in heavy wind. And I was like, that's better than I could have done by myself on the Duncan L. Hines with no tug support. And they had two tugs on them. And I think they did quite well. When you preach safety, you got to play into the game. And it goes back to what I said about the two previous cases, where really it's the master and commander of the vessel who makes those decisions on how fast or the movement of your deckhands and putting the barges in place. And that was a big thing with me. And that really turned me off because I had better performance with my crews on the week that I worked than the other crew that worked. We worked 7 on, 7 off, and I averaged 7 minutes per barge per main line uh, in the calculations versus my other crew that worked opposite of me managed 14 minutes per barge per main line. I guess I sit there and did the analytics, and you know we can sit here and do paperwork and in the office per se and say, okay, it's just like playing football players or fantasy football or baseball. You can look at that, but you don't really understand what it is to be out there on the water, on the deck, putting those barges together with the weather conditions and the way the boat works, how the wires have to be laid, especially when as a deckhand, I can always remember having wires messed up or kinks in the wires. There's a lot of factors. But I was very proud of the fact that I had a good relationship with my pilots and captains and my deck crew as well when I got to see them or talk to them on the phone. Because I think it's personality and the ability to get the most out of somebody by being kind to a certain extent, but expect certain goals to be reached. And I think having that personal nature really helps a company instead of hurts it. Because we get too cold these days, and you see it in law a lot. People sit down there and they'll play on their phone. They'll send emails that can have 3 or 4 meanings in the words. Whereas if you just picked up the phone and talked to these people and asked them, hey, how are the weather conditions? How things are going? You would get more done instead of just writing out an email going, oh, you need to pick up this barge and this barge and this. You got to give positive reinforcement, and occasionally you gotta hammer down. Sometimes, I mean, I've had a lot of captains and pilots test me, but at the end of the day, I ended up having other captains and pilots yell at them for laying on their leg for not doing their job they're supposed to do. But it's a team effort no matter what you do. And I think the biggest thing for me in dispatching was the amount of information you could give to that captain and pilot, what we were planning step by step. And nothing more that pissed me off than to have some idiot sitting in the conference room table that was above me who didn't want to talk to me and didn't want to explain the whole picture. And then 15 minutes later, after working 3 hours on a tow, break it up because we wanted to build it a different way. And I would sit there and I'd look at those people and I said, you could have told me this about 2.5 hours ago before these guys put all that sweat equity into it. And yes, changes happen. And one of the biggest things that I might have gotten in trouble with my superiors is I always had a saying: we're not landing 747s. We're moving barges that move at 5 to 15 miles an hour. Pound your head against the desk until something useful comes out, and then come back to me, or include me in what you want to do, and maybe we can come up with a strategic solution. And if you don't, then you're just wasting manpower, wasting fuel, and then your morale on the boat goes down, and then little things happen like uh people work slower, they're not watching what they're doing, and then you have instances that happen. And so when I left ACBL, I had a little bit of a bitter pill in my mouth, but I wanted to go I still wanted to go work in the office, back for another barge climb. And so when I left, I went down to New Orleans the week that I left, and I started handing out resumes like condoms at a gangbang. I mean, I was spreading the wealth, and AEP approached me, and I told them one price, and they said, "Woo, that's a little too much than we were thinking." And of course, 3 months down the road, I'm sitting in front of Kenny and Darren Chambers because they had hired somebody that couldn't hack it. So there I was.
Before we dive too deep into your time at AEP, did you know Joe Ward?
Yes, I did. Joe Ward was a very kind individual, very knowledgeable about the Gulf. He knew everything that you wanted to ask. That gentleman, I was so happy for him when he got a boat named after him. He knew the canals like the back of his hand, and we had something in common. His wife was a lawyer too, so I had aspirations at the time to go to law school. So we always had an interesting time talking about uh, how lawyers are and how many arguments you can get into, to say the least. But Joe's a hell of a guy, and I learned a hell of a lot from him because he took the time to teach me, and that's what I was craving. I wanted people like Kenny, like Darren, like Terrence Gomez that would sit there and explain the certain things. And even Mark Stoppel, who was the VP at AEP and at ACBL, just sit there and explain to me. And we'll go into AEP here in a minute, but I will say having that opportunity to learn from those people above me who would take me under their wing as somebody who showed a lot of enthusiasm, then it made it a lot easier.
In one of our preliminary phone calls, I believe I shared with you that Vicky Kane was the one that hired me at AEP. What we didn't get into was that Joe Ward was my first supervisor.
Oh,
So I got to learn from him, and a lot of the things you were saying spurred some memory. His biggest message to me was communication, communication, communication. That is carried forward with certain individuals I work with now at Ingram. But another point Joe made was that to never lie to customers. And to this day, I think, what is that, 9 years now in the industry? I have certainly held to that. But getting back to some of the things you were saying about communication and building relationships with these captains and pilots out there and how important that is to make our lives easier. That's part of what spurred this podcast, actually, because I was on the phone with these guys, rattling on about who knows what. And I would always sit back and think, man, I wish I was recording this. Some conversations, obviously, I wouldn't publish, but many others I certainly would have. So that brought back some good memories of my time over the years. But of course, my career began at AEP with walking in, meeting Kenny Crapel's pretty face. Tell me about that time at AEP. You said you're working nights, I think, where we left off.
yes, sir. I was working nights. I was young. I was, I was still young and no relationship. So I was down there at a convent, living in Gonzales, Louisiana, on a 12-hour plan, meaning that my apartment could be packed in 12 hours and get the hell out of Dodge. I will tell you the first week or so, uh, I experienced my first fog in down there in the sugarcane fields of South Louisiana, and I was following the early version of Google Maps, and it got me turned into a sugarcane field in the middle of the dark, foggy, and all I could think of, because I studied Appalachian history in college, and I traveled throughout Eastern Kentucky, and all I could think of was hearing the banjos from Deliverance starting to play in between the frog noises. And I said to myself, if I hear banjos, I'm out. And we're done. We're done. I mean, I can't handle that. So, working at convent as a convent convict out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, I played out. It was an awesome office. Don't get me wrong, but it was in the middle of nowhere. And of course, everything you had to drive and coming back at in the mornings. I always tried to stay um, until light time, till it was light. I had ran into a few intoxicated drivers in my past driving at night, coming from work, and they'd always end up at least one car in the marsh uh, between the highways to get to Gonzales. So I thought, safety first. Let's just wait till the sun comes up and the cops come out. Uh, so I usually would have breakfast with my captains and pilots that were working and living in the dorm. So I'd have breakfast with them and shoot the breeze with them and have a good time with them. Now, working in the office at AEP was totally different. The barges and boats were right across the levee. If there was a problem, and that was the other thing, I could forward my phone finally to my cell phone. And I made most of my important decisions outside, away from that silly desk and that god awful magnetic board that, oh, as a person with with attention deficit disorder, I still don't know how I figured that thing out. And I could figure out by the third or fourth day where pretty much all the barges were. But those damn magnets, oh, they killed me. And of course, everybody would try to steal my markers for that stupid whiteboard. And I was very particular about my whiteboard. I mean, I sat there with alcohol and cleaned it. It was shiny like I worked on the boat. But the magnets were the biggest thing. And Kenny and Vicky King were always of the old school mentality where they would update the board as things moved. And I was of the mentality of screw that. I'll wait till 4 in the morning, stressed out, waiting for a fleet picture. I'll figure it out then. And of course, I was pretty good at that. So I got really good with the magnet board. I could sit at my desk next to it and fling barges onto it and get them pretty close to where they needed to be. But I love the fact that I could walk across the highway, probably get run over, but that's all right. Walk up on the levee and see actually what was going on at the same time. And one of my biggest adversaries there was the stevedores with the ships, because in their world with the agents and the international boats and stuff, it's time is money. Time is always money. And so especially with the ocean going ships. So they're always pushing the envelope, asking us to do things that I felt uncomfortable asking my captains and pilots. And I can't tell you how many times in high water I would go out there and watch a overloaded vessel try to get into the upper anchor ship and literally break all the Kevlar lines because the river was too swollen and too too fast for us to really be doing anything in the fleet. But I could see it with my own eyes. And that's what I like the most about that. Uh, I bought a fancy digital camera and played Japanese tourist out there and really took some awesome pictures that are to this day still probably sitting in that office. But the thing I liked the most was is I could communicate face to face now, not just through a telephone with those crew members. And those crew members meant a lot to me because there were a lot of life stories that they had and stories that I had that we all shared amongst each other. But one of the biggest things for me down in Convent was the fact that New Orleans Airport was so close, so close. And I worked 7 on, 7 off. So I had a passport in my hand and working nights, you get bored. And no, I did not look at other activities that most people would do at night. I would search the websites and look for travel deals. So I went to Russia. I went to Moscow. I went all over the world just because I had 7 days off. Uh, I found a deal to go to Moscow, and I told one of my friends from college that had never traveled outside the United States that he couldn't say no, and so we went to Moscow for a week, and it was really interesting because Vicky and Kenny and Darren were like, "Well, Mr. Morris, where are you going this week?" And I said, "Well, I might fly up to New York and see my sister, or I might go home or hell, I might go to Mexico. I don't know. Whatever deal I could find, I could get. And I traveled so much that I was able to get status on U.S. Airlines. So, what really bugged my captains and pilots that worked with me in the dorms is that every Tuesday or Wednesday when we got off, uh, I would I wasn't allowed to take the crew van, so I had to drive myself and park my own car, and I'd meet them on the airplane, and I would get upgraded, and they wouldn't, and then they would yell at me. They were like, "Oh, we see how it is. The office people are sitting here in first class, while us working people have to sit in peasant class." No, it's not the case. I'm spending half my salary now just on plane tickets alone. You got to earn those miles to get upgraded. And they always tease me about that. They were like, "Where in the world are you going today, Walter?" And Louisiana, I will say, when you're an outsider coming up, as they would say, from the north, which I'm from Louisville, so I'm not really from the north, but for a period of time, for the first couple months at AEP, since I worked by myself, nobody wanted to hang out with me after work was done, and so I got lonely. So that's why I traveled a lot. So finally, Kenny and I started hanging out together, and oh Lord, the stories I could tell. Uh, he would take me down to. He would take me to on our days off. We would go down to his father's house down in Lafitte, and I always tease Kenny that like the first time I went down there, I was thinking it's going to be the water boy, and there would be like frogs and alligators in the front yard and stuff. And he goes, "Walter, you're reading into it too much." And he took me out into the pen. He took me all the way in the bayou, in and out, all over these places, and a really unique experience that I could have, where anybody could go hire a charter fisherman to take them, but I had a really cool friend and a 30 pack of Bud Light and some gas money. We had a blast, and so uh, I would always go with Kenny and sometimes with his father, and they would always laugh at me because uh, I didn't want to touch the fish. When we caught the fish, I was like, "Can you take it off the hook?" Or I'd have to put gloves on. I was very particular about my hand, and they'd always laugh at me. In fact, uh, my next door neighbor down at my farm calls me the country club hunter. I can shoot the deer, but I don't want to gut it. So Kenny and I did a lot of adventures together. Got thrown out of a couple of bars. Uh, had some fun on Bourbon Street, to say the least. And we got to be very good friends in the process. And it was hard sometimes because he was my boss at the end of the day, and that made it hard sometimes when he had to crack down on me. But we were very strong-willed individuals that we could be great friends outside of the work, but there was always a little bit of tension at work because he and I would go after each other. But it's just like an older brother, to say the least.
Walter Lee, looking over your resume here somewhere, looks like you were with AEP until 2011. Um, if there's no more stories you care to share that come to mind of highlights or lowlights of your time, maybe without Kenny on the job, um, we can move forward into your legal career. So, is there anything else that comes to mind with your from your time at AEP up until
Oh
2011?
yeah. Oh, oh yeah, of course, of course. 2000, 2009 or 2008, I was working, of course, that night with the Mel Oliver incident and when they shut down the river. And I was actually there, which made it really interesting because fast forward, when I was at Tulane getting my master's in admiralty law, I was, of course, in uh, class having to share the true experience of what really happened and not what was written in the book. But I will go back to my time again with Vicky Kane, OVC, Victor Charlie. Oh, Victor Charlie. I met Vicky Kane back in the day when she was working, I believe, uh, for another company right below. It was part of National Marine back in the day. I can't remember the exact company she worked for, but I actually got to meet her for the first time when I was working at ACBL. And she about got me stung with a wasp in the office when I was sitting talking to her. And I said, this lady is crazy, but I like her. She's pretty cool. So fast forward to working for AEP, VC is there. And Vicky was one of those cats, sort of like ACBL, where she wanted to be a part of the action. And she didn't really like that I went and talked to my boats outside and knew what was going on, but she tolerated me. When she became my superior, it was a little interesting because uh, if I was working nights, she'd be there a little bit after work, and I could always hear her freshly manicured nails hit that keyboard, and they'd go clickety clack, and I could tell when VC was mad because those fingernails would get digger and harder onto that keyboard, and you knew whatever you were doing was not making her happy. But fast forward that she was always she was level headed. She'd yell at you, and I can still remember hearing that high pitched uh, woman's voice yelling and screaming at you like, "No, this is wrong. You're not doing it correctly." Blah blah blah. It's like, Vicky, don't worry. Everything's gonna be working out. It'll all work out. And so I'll never forget uh, when I was working nights and she was working days as supervisor. She would call me literally at 2 o'clock in the morning every day that I was on watch, and she's like, "Has Laura Rogers left the fleet? Has Charlotte Rouse done what she was supposed to do?" And it's like, Vicky, I love you, but you need to get your prostate checked because you're waking up going to pee this late at night. I'm starting to worry about you. Everything's gonna be fine. I'm here. It's okay. Don't worry. Um, they really called me the master of disaster at AEP because I was involved in a lot of incidents that happened. Besides what I said earlier, I had uh, breakaways. I had sinking barges happen to me. Stowaways right next to the National Strategic Reserve, which always made it interesting because you'd be amazed how many different federal departments of whatever would show up when that happened. But I always was pretty good about not writing anything on emails, so there was no evidence. It was all talking, and that always helped out a lot, especially with their legal counsel. That everything there wasn't any evidence to give the opposition. But uh, Vicky King was sort of a stepmom to me to a certain extent. Uh, she uh, she had a son that was a little bit younger than I was, so here I am flying off, doing all kinds of crazy things and having fun. And we would connect sometimes outside of work, but it wasn't really till after I got out of law school that she and I became closer friends with the death of her son. But I was always the guy who did tech support for her. She she'd get a new phone or television and she'd be like, "I need your help. Come here and hook this up." So that was with her. But another thing that I was able to in the later years at AAP, I was able to connect with Mark Stoppel and Mark Kanoy, and those two gentlemen really fostered me to expand my career horizons. Um, Kanoy was very nice to me and sat down with me like no CEO would ever do with a person and sit there. Here's a gentleman that worked in the fleets, moved his way up all the way to being CEO of the company. And I wanted to follow in his footsteps. I was going to go a different path, but that's what I wanted to do. The goal for me, and it is today, is still I like my name on the side of a boat, and not because of an ego trip. It's because it'd be a culmination of all the achievements that I have done and helped the river industry to complete. Stoppel was the same way. Stoppel taught me the ins and outs of as far as sales go, uh, what the uh, the St. Louis Board of Trade and the actual numbers when it came to moving barges down from the upper rivers into the lower harbor as far as freight rates go and that kind of thing. But he and I talk on a regular basis till this day. I know he's retired now and living somewhere in Kansas. But those two individuals, from a upper management standpoint, really helped me pursue uh, moving on and going to law school.
So 2011 comes around and you depart the industry once again. Do you go directly into law school?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. One last thing after Lamarck's passing, AEP put in a newer safety uh, policy and for wearing life jackets and going into the pool. And I'll never forget my mentor at AEP corporate uh, who helped me get into law school. He said something very poignant to me right before I went to law school, and he says, "You know, Walter, you're gonna hate me when I say this to you, but after law school, you'll understand." And what I'm about to repeat is something that some people will find offensive and cold, but on the other hand, it makes sense. And that he said to me, Walter, it's cheaper to maim them, or excuse me, it's cheaper to kill them than it is to maim. And going into law school, I wanted to answer that question for myself. And that was, why is it cheaper than than for someone to get hurt? So I leave. I end up getting accepted to Western Michigan, now Cooley Law School, up in Lansing, Michigan. I do my bon voyage in August of 2011. Uh, Everybody is very happy for me. I move out. I ended up spending one night in Louisville, where I grew up, at my parents' house, and then the next day I was up in Lansing packing my stuff into an apartment for three years. And so Cooley is one of those law schools where they let everybody in, but they don't let everybody out. And I started with a class of 400 kids, of people that, main law schools or the bigger law schools won't accept because of certain LSAT scores or grade point averages. Cooley was designed to break that barrier and give people a chance by their merits, not just how well they could do on the test. So I go to Cooley Law School for 3 years. My legal career at Cooley was pretty interesting. Of course, I was 30 or so by that time, so I'd already bought a house and I'd already sold a house. I had the river experience. You go into the school, law school, and they tell you, my uncle, my late uncle, was a labor lawyer down in Nashville for Bass, Berry and Sims, and he basically said to me, Walter, imagine going to Alice in Wonderland and going down the rabbit hole, because that is law school. It's the Matrix. It's not reality, but it is reality. Things that you think of from a non-legal perspective versus as you are as a lawyer. You always have to think 3 steps in front of you and 3 steps behind you, and where everything can interlope or interact, and what kind of problems that could arise. And so law school was, it wasn't just learning the facts of the law or knowing, what the elements to a crime were or the elements to a tort. It was learning that how to move in and outside the law in order to get the outcome you wanted to, even if the case was not in your favor, is how much you could limit your client's liability. But law school was quite an adventure. Now I've lived mostly my life in the South, so I wasn't really used to the northern weather, and Michigan being Michigan. Having 6 inches of snow a night, or having ice on the roads. I was used to a certain extent, but now I was walking into class at a -11, uh, like I was in the freezer at my previous jobs. It was, I was a lot older. I knew why I was there, not just because it was the next step. Because of Lamarck's passing and the lessons I had learned from being on the boat and in politics, that I knew a legal career was the best way I could make an impact. Uh, Having that knowledge was a blessing and somewhat of a curse to a certain extent, because you had to uh, go without thinking too much to go down that rabbit hole and get lost and not know where you are, versus keeping it simple. Now, I will tell you an interesting thing, and it's sort of it's a funny story to a certain extent, but it sort of explains law school in a nutshell. And a lot of people can relate to this. I hope this doesn't offend anybody, but here it is. Back in my day, working on the deck and working on the towboat, you got pornographic material that came on the boat, and of course, Hustler and Penthouse Forum. And if you take a Penthouse Forum letter and put it next to a legal opinion, it's basically the same outcome. So when I graduated high school, I couldn't read very well. I wasn't a very good reader or a strong reader at all. But let me tell you something. I learned how to read, and unfortunately, that was reading pornography, which is okay. You got to get to the money shot. So you put a legal case and a Penthouse Forum case. There's always a rule, an issue, the analysis, and the conclusion to any law case. And if you read a legal opinion, they always talk about the background facts, the legal ruling, the analysis, and then the conclusion. So you take the Penthouse Forum letter about the bored housewife who thinks the husband's cheating on her, and she likes to play tennis, and so the caring tennis pro teaches her how to improve her swing. So put that in a law case. So you got your issue. She feels alone, depressed, not she's afraid that her husband's cheating on her. And then you got your rule, like you shouldn't cheat on your wife or your husband, but he's cheating, so what the hell? And then you go in through the analysis, like, well, he's a caring, loving tennis pro. He's really helped me work on my swing and do some other things, and he really listens to me. And then, of course, the money shot, the conclusion of them hooking up, and bam, there's your conclusion in a law case. So I looked at every thousands of pages I have looked through, and any legal battle, and legal case or opinion that was been published, as basically a porn sheet. Basically, here's the problem. You read through it real quickly. Okay, you see where the two parties sort of combat to a certain extent, and bam, this is what happened. This is why it happened. Here's the conclusion. So it's a little unorthodox, but it got me through law school. It got me through a lot of things. So that being said, going through law school, since Cooley wasn't really a ranked school like a Harvard or a Yale type deal, that I knew that for me to get hired on uh, in the field, I would have to end up going to get a more advanced degree. But Cooley gave me an opportunity when most people wouldn't, and I am very appreciative of that. I spoke about my times on the boat a lot. It helped me a lot in class when it came to contracts and negotiations, and being that 40-year-old asshole that didn't put up with crap. Like, no, that's not what it's going to be. This is the way it is. Deal with it. Go pound sand. Or, reading about one of my favorite classes at Cooley Law School was the DUI class on drunk driving. And I almost booked the class, which meant getting the highest grade in the class by 2 points. And the main question that professor asked at the beginning of the class, he asked, "Why did you come to law school?" And I was being sort of a smart ass. I said, "Well, I got a 95-mile-an-hour speeding ticket. I want to know how to get out of it." Spend $280,000 on an education to learn how to get out of a speeding ticket. They're cheaper alternatives. It's called leaving your foot off the gas. But I met several influential people, and one of which was the dean at Cooley Law School. His name is Charles Toy. And Charles went down to New Orleans for me, and he was doing some recruitment as well as fundraising for the law school. And he stopped by Tulane Law School and talked about this really interesting guy that worked on the river that wants to get his LLM at Tulane. So I graduated from Cooley Law School in 2014. I went to school all year round. So I got out of there within 3 years. I had applied for and got into Tulane Law School, and I was very, very, very happy. Not from the standpoint that, you know, I could have gone and got my license and been done with law school, but I really wanted to do Admiralty Maritime Law because of all the experiences that I had both inside the levee, as you would say, and outside the levee. And so when I got to Tulane, it was a totally different experience for me because here I had already gotten my Juris Doctorate or my JD, so it was more of like a NASCAR victory lap. Uh, I knew what law school was. It wasn't different. It was a lot easier than Cooley Law School was because Cooley was very hard as far as academics go. Tulane for me was a little bit easier, and so I was one of 9 students out of a class of 50. One of 9 American students out of a class of 50. So I had 20 or so Chinese students and kids from Germany, Spain, South America, all over the world, even Australia. And so, needless to say, I was the cool American driving Suburban that I could fit 8 or 9 of those guys because foreign students are skinny. They're not like big fat Americans. So my job, since I had lived down in New Orleans for so long, or in the area, I had this killer apartment on St. Charles Avenue at 7th and St. Charles, right next to the cathedral for the Episcopal Church. And so I was rocking. I had a blast. And I basically, the other 8 American students really didn't interact too much with the internationals. But I thought this is a time for me to really have a good time with some kids and have find some couches I can crash on my future travel experiences. So, needless to say, I got to know all these fine people, and my goal a lot of the times when I first met them, these individuals, was to put them in the Suburban, take them down to Lafitte, or take them somewhere out in the middle of the bayou where the cell phones wouldn't work. They would get very concerned. If their cell phone wouldn't work, then they're like, "Oh, what are we going to do? I can't look down and text everybody." I was like, and I used to play the jingle from Deliverance, like, "Here it comes." But one of the biggest things that they love doing is I was a good fan of the Second Amendment, so I had my firearms down there, and most of them had never handled a firearm, so we go shoot up stuff. So they finally understood what an AR-15 was, and they are like, "Walter, this is fun." I said, "Well, come an American, you can do this." And I always tease the girls. I said, "Just remember, my green card costs money if you want to marry me. So I ain't going for cheap. I got student loans to pay for." But anyhow, so being a maritime admiralty student there at Tulane, I had another gentleman by the name of Matthew Pele who was a longshoreman up in New Jersey, and he and I had gone to a similar law school before going to Tulane. And so he had the shore experience, I had the river experience, and together we caused hell in class. Like we'd always argue, it's damn stevedore's fault, not the ship's fault or the boat's fault. But one story in particular comes to mind, and I love this because it's one of those things where you sit in a class with 100 kids in the class, 20 LLM Admiralty students, and a two second L or 3L law students. So they're either in their middle year or their last year of law school. And you can always tell in law school those people who prepared and those who didn't. Those who prepared never went and this, and then they'd look at their notes and try to figure it out. Those who were not prepared, or excuse me, those who were prepared didn't do that. Those who were not prepared, it was a damn train wreck. They couldn't figure out what was going on. And this in particular individual was not very nice to me in the beginning. He looked at me and sort of looked down at me at a law school event. He goes, "So you're one of the LLM students?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm Walter Morris. It's a pleasure meeting you." He goes, "Well, where did you go to law school?" And I said, "I went to Cooley Law School." And he goes, "Oh, and they let you here?" And I said, "Buddy, you're a 2L student. I have my JD. I'm done. This is just a victory lap. I can go take the bar tomorrow. You haven't even completed law school, so take your chauvinistic attitude and go have fun with it." So this idiot decided to go in Dr. Force's class. Now, Dr. Force was an older gentleman in his 70s by the time I got to him, and he was the main person at Tulane for their Maritime LLT program, which some would say one of the best programs in the world for maritime law. And lots of people from all over the world come to Tulane for that experience. But Dr. Force is very subtle. He acts like he doesn't hear you, but the guy has perfect hearing. So this gentleman that I was talking about who poo-pooed me was struggling with the case, going and 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 so at the end of his class dissertation of the case, he had the gall to ask the most idiot question you could ask. And it goes back to there are dumb people in this world and then there's stupid. One that asks a dumb question and so on and so forth. Well, this gentleman asked at the end of the comment on the case, he's like, "Dr. Force, I was confused. What is a master of a ship?" And I'm sitting in the back row of a classroom that holds 100 kids in the room, and I'm in the back row or so, and under my breath, I go, "You idiot! It's the captain of the vessel. I mean, how dumb can you be? You're in Admiralty class." And Dr. Force quickly looked at me and said, looked down on this piece of paper, found my picture. He said, "Mr. Morris, would you stand up and explain to the class what a master of the ship is?" I said, "By all means, sir." He goes, "Now, let me tell the class that Mr. Morris used to work on a towboat up and down the Ohio Mississippi River, so he does know what's going on. He's not just read it in a book." So I stand up and said, "Professor, the captain of, or the master of a vessel is the captain of the vessel. He decides who lives, who dies, who chips, who paints, who stooges, who sleeps." And I said, "Dr. Force, may I make an analogy?" He goes, "By all means." I said, "Well, Professor, the master of the vessel is sort of like the professor in this classroom. He can decide who lives and who fails." And my suggestion to the fellow student asking this question is that instead of one making a fool of himself, he should ask one of the LLM students who might save him the harassment that he's going to receive. I said, Captain, it's a professor. Captain is a master of the vessel. He decides who's going to live and who's going to die, just like the professor who's going to decide who's going to pass and who's going to fail. That was the line. And he said, Mr. Morris, I've been teaching this class for 30 some odd years. That's one of the best answers I've ever heard. You may take your seat. And I sat down, sort of smiling, laughing a little bit. And that I could see that guy sitting down too, just red in the face and so upset. And all my LLM buddies are sitting next to me, just like pat me on the back, like you rock, thank you. This is awesome. So the funny story about law school is that when I got to when I got into my second semester at Tulane, I took towage and offshore services. And towage was learning about the river and the law of towboats and barges and uh, offshore vessels in the Gulf of Mexico. And in fact, sadly to say, it was my lowest grade in law school, a C, because I argued a certain way that I thought I was right on the exam, and I was not. But I had to be careful with law school because it's all done anonymously. And if you put too much information about yourself in the exam, you could be called out for cheating, for trying to uh, tell the professor who you are. You're supposed to be just a number. But in towage and offshore services was my cup of tea, because here we were, first couple of weeks we were talking about towboats, and I'd sit there in class and just put a big smile on my face and say, Professor, it's not a tugboat, it's a towboat. And so finally, after like third week of class, I asked one of my captains I used to work with at ACBL to come to class with me. So here's old Captain Todd. And it was sort of like when you were a child in kindergarten and you bring a show and tell, or you bring your father to the classroom to tell what his daddy or mommy do for a living. Well, I brought Captain Todd, and Captain Todd came in and said, big old thick Cajun accent with bright hair. He says, I understand that you've been calling my towboat a tugboat. And the professor looks at me. He goes, Can I help you, sir? He goes, Yeah, I'm with Mr. Morris. He told me you were telling the class and teaching them wrong that my towboat's a tugboat. He goes, a tugboat pulls along and drags along. A towboat pushes the issue and gets it through. So we had a really interesting back and forth when that happened. And of course, that will lead me into the thing with Mel Oliver, because we always talked about that case in that class and all the things that had happened. So when I graduated from Tulane, I spent a year down in New Orleans, and I was attempting to take the Louisiana bar, and unfortunately, I didn't make the Louisiana bar, but I had done some consulting here and there as far as law goes from a non-lawyer standpoint. I finally went back up to Kentucky, to Louisville, and worked for the DA's office, or the district attorney for Louisville. And I worked in their office for about 2 years, I believe. And I finally passed the bar in Kentucky, and I did DUI diversion, which wasn't very fun. It was about, it was a diversion program instead of being adjudicated or having a sentence placed on them. They had to do several things in order to complete the program. Well, but the DA's office sort of, for me, I had 4 years of law school. I was done. Most of the interns there were people that were still in law school at U of L. And so, there was some connection there, but not much. And me being a Republican working for a Democrat, there was some tension there to a certain extent. The DA asked me, he goes, how can I expect your loyalty if you're working for me and you're registered as a Republican? And I quickly told him, I said, well, let me share something with you, sir. My father and my grandfather helped you get elected to this position, and I will tell you, loyalty comes with a paycheck. And as long as you're cashing them in, I'll be loyal. But the day you say no more paychecks, I can't guarantee loyalty. So I stayed with the DA's office for a couple, like I said, a couple years. Got my license within 6 months of getting my license. I knew that they weren't going to make me an attorney there, so I said it's time for me to roll out. So I stopped, and so I left there, and I went to out on my own to do some things on my own, and I met a very interesting lady from Morocco, and ended up joining her court in Casablanca, doing arbitration and arbitration of cases that were from all over the world. You had the Greeks fighting the Chinese ship owners, or the Europeans fighting over fishing rights and other areas of the world. A lot of really boring details as far as certain cases go, but most of it was on Zoom, especially, of course, after the COVID situation. Uh, so I was at the in 2020. I was at the conference at Tulane for the Maritime Association, and Asanya, the main lady for the court of arbitration in Morocco, was with me, and well, the king of Morocco decided to shut down the airways. And so here, Asanya and I stayed together for 110 days in Louisville, and she couldn't go home, and I was there as shelter and comfort and so on and so forth. But she had got on me for gaining weight. She had gotten me a few times that I had visited Morocco. She didn't like how I was dressing, so she went and had suits made for me, and very nice Italian custom suits. I mean, I was looking good, and she was fussing at me. She's laughing at me right now while I'm talking to you on this podcast. She she got on me because my stomach area was a little fluffy. She said I looked like the Michelin man. And my neck was okay, but my stomach was very fluffy. So anyhow, I tried to put her on the plane. Unfortunately, that didn't work out. So we drove up to Kentucky, and we went to go see where Elvis was. And this was during the time that the pandemic was really starting. And so a couple of weeks, about a week later, after we get up to Louisville, she starts getting ill, and I take her to urgent care, and they said, "Oh, she's got COVID," and they didn't check me out because I was 40 years old. So they're like, "You'll be fine." So a week later, I'm sitting on the or standing on the floor, and I'm standing on the floor and sitting there with huge cramps in my legs, and I'm squirming around like a flopping fish on the deck of a barge, and I was really hurting. And she looked at me and she goes, "Walter Lee, I love you, but you're gonna have to go see a doctor because you've gained too much weight, and you don't look right. You're looking yellow on me." So I go back to the urgent care, and they do some blood work on me, and this is April 17th of 2020. And I was 40 years old. I didn't think I was uh out of I was fluffy, but I wasn't like monstrally big, and I didn't drink that much in college and in law school. I was always the one that took you home, and as Kenny will tell you, I was the one to make sure that nobody got locked up. We'll say that. So I went to the urgent care. They took my blood, and the average human has 150,000 platelets to 400,000 platelets. And when they took my blood, I had 22,000 platelets and I could bleed out at any time. And I'm like, how the hell did this happen? And they're like, you need to go to the emergency room. We're going to call an ambulance. And of course, stubborn me as usual goes, hell no, I'll drive myself. I don't need anybody. So I drove home. I got my phone chargers and a pair of headphones, and I looked at the sign and I said, "Don't kill the cats. I'll be back." And so I get back I go to the hospital in Louisville, and they run my test. And the gentleman comes in and he looks at me and he goes, "Mr. Morris, you're in liver failure. Your MELD score, or your score of how well your liver is doing or functioning, is really, really bad. In fact, I'm going to redo the numbers, but we might fly you to the University of Kentucky tonight for emergency liver transplant." And it was a big shock for me. I mean, here I was, about to start a real career. I had to talk to a major law firm before the conference about coming and join them before the pandemic. And here I was now faced with a life changing situation. And so he comes back in a few minutes later and he goes, "Mr. Morris, we redid the math. You don't need an emergency transplant, but you will need a transplant shortly. It's just your liver's failing. You have cirrhosis, uh, and you claim that you don't drink. And so more than likely it's fatty liver disease, or uh, having fat on your liver, or causing scarring of your liver, and eventually, you know, uh, your liver can regenerate, but once it starts being in cirrhosis, it scars and you cannot regenerate." I'm in the hospital. I'm sitting. They admit me into the hospital, and I go upstairs into a medium hot zone, as they called me, because they had not given me my first COVID test. So 1 o'clock in the morning it comes in. They gouge that thing in my nose. Now the first time of 29 times throughout this whole situation. And they come back about 3 hours later and they say, "Mr. Morris, you have COVID." And I said, "Well, I don't have any symptoms." And they're like, "We've tested you twice on it. You've got COVID." And the first thing I could think of was, damn, Asanya gave me the Ebola monkey. The Ebola monkey from Africa got me. How in the hell could I have got COVID? I'm fine. So anyhow, they put me in the hot zone at the hospital, and I quickly learned that the white chalk line was not a fun chalk line, and I spent there the first 5 days of a 114-day stint that I've had with my transplant. And so they pump my stomach, because when your liver fails, you start to gather up fluid because your liver can't process all the toxins in your bloodstream, and you collect fluid in your abdomen. And unfortunately for males, in the fun zone, to say the least. And yes, grapefruit size is very painful. Um, so fast forward to July 13th of 2020. Hasanya is almost uh, almost ready to go home. She's booking a flight with the ambassador from Morocco that she's good friends with, and my parents had just come back in from New York, and my sister was there. And I'll never forget. It was 9 o'clock at night in the morning, and I looked at the sign and I said, "I don't feel too good," and I passed out. I passed out, and before all this happened, after I had gotten back from the hospital in April, she begged and pleaded with me to build a notebook, sort of like Roadhouse, the movie Roadhouse with Patrick Swayze. He had all his medical records in a book. And so, here I am, knocked out, don't know where I am. She could put the folder on me and they could figure out what was wrong with me. So I pass out. My sister wakes me up. And the first thing I do, I throw up. I threw up a liter of blood like the exorcist, just all over the place. And the ambulance was called. And when the ambulance showed up fairly quickly, not like convent, but very quickly, they put me in the ambulance with the folder on my chest. And as they were going up my road, the paramedic looked at me and then said to the driver, he says, he won't make Audubon. His blood pressure's dropping. He's failing on me. He's going in and out of consciousness. We're gonna have to take him to women's and children's. And I remember saying this quite clearly because I don't remember the next 4 days very well, but I do remember telling the paramedic, I said, I don't know. I think I need to tuck it in if they're going to let me in the women's and children's hospital. Hold on a second. And she just sits there and she laughs a little bit. She goes, you're about to die, but you're laughing. And I said, I know, I know. And so I get in the ER. They do all the triage things that you see on the medical shows, and cut your shirt, that thing, and I fade out. And the doctor had told my sister and father that if I did not have my medical records the way I had them in that book, that it would have been an extra 10 minutes of trying to figure out what's wrong with me, and I probably wouldn't be here today. But they knew what kind of problems I had, and they could quickly get me a transfusion, and they knew what was going on. So I spent 4 days there in Louisville, and then finally I went to the University of Kentucky, where I started doing my testing for a transplant, to get in the transplant program. And so 11 days being with your sister, who's 9 years older, and Asanya finally getting able to fly back home to Morocco, and I'm sitting there going, "Damn, I almost died twice. I don't remember 4 days of your life, and then things are still blurry. With liver failure, your ammonia levels can get high in your bloodstream, which causes a dementia-like uh, psychosis in your brain. So you don't know what's going on, or you're very absent. So I was suffering from that to a certain extent, and again, I had fluid on me. So I go through all the testing at UK. They determined that yes, that did need a transplant, and it needed to be urgent. And they scheduled another surgery for me to do a temporary fix so I could last a little bit longer till I could find a donation. And so uh, October 9th of 2020, I'm coming back from Indianapolis, having had my two front teeth knocked out because they were infected. And they called me at UK and they say, Mr. Morris, you're officially on the list. Please be ready to have a go bag. You might get a phone call. We don't know if it's going to be today, tomorrow, or 6 months down the road, but you got to be prepared. And I said, okay. So I had a backpack and I had all my stuff in it. And I was ready to go at a moment's notice. And that period of time, I was like, I'm like a green banana. And by the time I was a green banana in April of 2020, I had started getting spots on me like an old rotten banana towards the end. Uh, by the time October came around, I was really, really sick. And so October 14th, I get a phone call from my transplant coordinator who was about to fuss at me for a very high blood sugar count. Um, when you have liver disease and cirrhosis, you can't eat a lot of salt. So I was pounding the fruits and vegetables, and I could only have 2 milligrams of salt. So no more cheeseburgers, no more Chick-fil-A. And so she was yelling at me about a recent blood test. And then she abruptly said, I got to go. And she hung up the phone. And it was about 10 o'clock in the morning. And the next thing I know, I get a phone call. And she said, Mr. Morris, we might have a liver for you. Are you willing to take a CDC high risk transplant? And I said, yes. And she goes, look, we need you to gather up your things and start heading to Lexington, which was an hour away. So my father and I get in the car. She goes, don't rush, just slow, we'll be fine. So I'm sitting there, and even in 2020, I still had my BlackBerry. I had a newer version of a BlackBerry. And as a bad lawyer, the one thing I had not done since going to law school and all that was I never filled out a will. So in most states, you can fill out a will holographically, which means writing it in your own pen and with your own ink and putting certain dates. And I remember the first couple of lines of mine, and mine says, today is the day that I was called for my liver transplant, October 14th, 2020. I'm in sound mind. I'm 41 years old here, or 42 at the time. Here's what's going on. 41. And so I get to the hospital. Now this is all typed up on the on the BlackBerry, but I had to write it out. So my father and I sat in the room at the hospital till about 6 o'clock when I told him you needed to go get something to eat, and I needed to sit there with a legal pad and write this out because I needed to get it done. Because I had read all the statistics about transplants, and there was a very good chance that I wouldn't make it out of this one. So I wanted to make sure I had everything signed up, signed off. So 8 o'clock comes around, and I meet the operating surgeon, and I go downstairs, and I go into the operating theater, and there's uh, three different Yeti coolers sitting in the operating room, and the first two contained blood transfusion, and the other one was my new liver, my new lease on life. And I'll never forget, they wrap you up in a burrito type deal, and they put all kinds of tubes in you and so on and so forth. And it was 8:46 when they started about to put the mask on me, and they're starting to fill me up with the good drugs. And I start singing Pink Floyd. Uh, I believe the Comfortably Numb was the song that I started singing. And the anesthesiologist starts laughing. He goes, "Oh my God, how can you be singing during this is a major deal?" And I said, uh, life is good. Let's see what happens. I trust in you. Let's make it happen. So I went to sleep at 8:46 that night and didn't wake up till 9 o'clock the next morning. And let me tell you, uh, I woke up in sort of a panic, uh, and they had an intubator or a ventilator on me. And usually after a transplant, you're on the ventilator for at least 12 hours, and I was on the ventilator for 3. They took it off of me at 3, and they restrained me, which they lock you into the bed, and they had the shades up, and the sun was coming into the room, and all I could say with muffling was, "I'm not dying yet. I ain't going to the light." So they took the ventilator off me. I said, "Close that damn shade. I ain't dying today." So I fell back asleep, and about an hour later, I believe, I hear my sister's voice, and she says, "Hello, I'm Lee. I mean Walter's sister. I'm here to be with him." And I heard the soft clicking noise of a rolling suitcase, and that was I knew then that I was going to live because they wouldn't have let her in without having with her luggage. And she had driven all night from New York to be with me. So we spent 28 days in the hospital together in the span of 2020. And that's what led into the last couple of years. Uh, the first year of my transplant, I was in the hospital a lot. And so was my second year. University of Kentucky was like their basketball program was one and done. So after your first year, they just, they got their statistics, they got their 95%. I survived. You're done. So they would put you in after your first year. They send you off to a different doctor, and you weren't on the transplant floor. And I was stuck in Motel H, or Motel 8, as I would call it, in the older part of the UK hospital. And finally, after doing a lot of soul searching and being frustrated because I was on a lot of drugs at the time, a lot of drugs, a lot of very toxic drugs, and I wasn't getting anywhere. I had many surgeries at that time, 14 surgeries to correct the bile duct connection for my liver. And finally, I said, enough is enough. And I looked at my doctor and I said, I went to Yale medical school and I got a second consult, and they said, Mr. Morris, we believe that the liver that you've received is not the right one, that we possibly might need to put you back on the list. And I handed that information to the University of Kentucky, and they said, no, you're fine. We're going to keep you on the drugs. You'll be okay. You'll make it. This, that, and the other. You just got to give it time. And I said, my time's up. I'm gone. So in January of last year, uh, at the end of January of last year, I went up to Connecticut where my sister lives and started with Yale, and have not been in the hospital since June. A lot of nights in the hospital, a lot of alone time, and I think a lot of things that I learned on the boat helped me through that. And that was, I was on call watch a few times when I was working on the boat, and you work call watch, you're in your room by yourself, waiting for them to call you and to work on you, to make you work on the tow and working and being in confined spaces. I mean, because a towboat, you don't have much room. It's a house. It's a wedding cake with maybe 2,000 square feet at the most. And of that 2,000 square feet, you might have 500 feet that you can really be around. That's not, it's common area, not just private rooms. So being stuck in a hospital room didn't affect me as much as it would with other people. And then again, I used the same techniques I used with my captains and pilots. I got to know my nurses, and I have very good relationship with several of my nurses I had at UK. I always handed out lapel pins with stethoscopes, and handed out pins that looked like syringes. But and then I did funny things like I had a pet possum, like a stuffed animal possum, that I put on my IV pole. And even to this day, when I look at people on television and they're in the hospital, if you don't have more than 3 pumps, I don't have much sympathy for you, because I usually had 5 to 6, and I've had all kinds of toxic chemicals in me. Uh, I've got two 55-gallon drum liners full of prescription pill bottles, but I'm here and I'm alive. And somebody gave me a chance. Somebody died and gave me a chance to be reborn. And it goes back to Lamarck. I mean, that gentleman passed away, and it's like I was given a new chance. And many people who get transplants don't make it their first year, and some of them towards the third and fifth year. If it's not going very well, like it has for me, you get very, very depressed. But I've been very blessed with the fact that I've had a very strong family and friends to get me through it. And so when I got to Yale, it was a blessing, because as soon as I got there, I started working with the two really great doctors, and they fixed my liver. My liver was pretty much shut down. The bile ducts inside your liver are like a tree, and those bile ducts inside my liver were closed, and they were able to stent them back open. Where the University of Kentucky either didn't have the knowledge to do it or didn't have the right equipment to do it. So I was very grateful to be up there, and so I still work with them today. and now I'm about to be released again to live my life. So it's been an interesting uh, trip. It's been a big bump in the road, but I guess my message to a lot of these people and the people that listen to this podcast, don't think that you're 40 and you might not be drinking that much or you might not be eating too much McDonald's, but there are little tell signs, and you need to get yourself checked up. And that's one of the things with captains and pilots. Of course, they have to go through their Coast Guard regulations and have their physicals and stuff. But it goes with everybody. You got to get checked. You never know. I didn't know till it was too late. When they pulled my original liver, the one I was born with, it was half the size and broke away in the tray, and I was approximately three to 4 weeks to death when they pulled it out. So uh, you gotta do what the doctor says, and you gotta challenge them sometimes, and you gotta make sure you do what's best for you, and you gotta be well read. I mean, a lot of the things you do in life, whether it's getting your captain's and pilot's license or getting your college degree or getting a law degree or even just simple things, simple medical things. You can't sit there and just read WebMD because they're not going to tell you but scare the crap out of you. You got to read the journals. You got to read into it. And so it all works. It all works out in the long run. And if it's your time to go, it's your time to go. But I think uh, it's the biggest life lesson to those who are listening is you got to get checked out, and it doesn't hurt. Do blood test, and you know where you stand. I was very lucky that I caught it when I caught it.
Well, Walter, I'm glad to see you on this end of things, and glad we finally got to do this. I'm sorry it took so long to meet up with you.
Oh no, it's quite an honor to be here, sir, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share my experiences, and hopefully down the road I can answer unique legal questions that come up down the road.
Well, again, man, I appreciate it. I'm glad we got to add your story here to my collection. We'll keep in touch soon, okay?
All right, I deeply appreciate it, Tim. Thank you so
Thanks.
much.
Thanks a lot. This has been a production of Where You At Studios, LLC.